Hi, everyone. I'm Kendall Gassner, an accessibility engineer at GitHub.
And I'm Katie McCormick. I'm the manager of the accessibility engineering team here at GitHub.
And today we will be presenting Measuring Ourselves, GitHub's Accessibility Scorecard.
In this talk, we're going to go through some potential organizational barriers to accessibility and the ones that we needed to address, how we took stock of what systems we could tap into to solve these barriers, and diving deeper into the actual accessibility scorecard, we will outline its three objectives: audit progress, static analysis through linting, and dynamic analysis through scanning and testing. Finally, we'll review a summary of our results together. To start with, what are your organization's barriers to accessibility?
So, some potential barriers your company might be facing could be technical limitations, missing knowledge about accessibility, lacking incentive to prioritize accessibility, and scaling a small accessibility team to meet the needs of a big company. Some problems we faced at GitHub were knowledge, incentives, and scaling. Knowledge. Many teams didn't know how to make their work accessible and were unintentionally removing accessibility fixes. Also, accessibility considerations were being made too late in the product lifecycle. Incentives. There wasn't enough motivation to prioritize accessibility in organizational roadmaps. And then scaling. Our speed and resources to provide reviews could not keep up with the number of PRs companies created each day.
When looking at these problems, we organized around three areas that could solve them. First, visibility. We needed a unified vision of accessibility for all of our digital products. And that vision needed to be visible in a place to track accessibility as it evolves across many features. Second, we needed education. As we make our progress with accessibility more visible, we wanted people to think beyond compliance and to understand that accessibility is not a one-time checkbox. It's ongoing and iterative. Third, we wanted to incentivize the behaviors that would lead to long-term accessibility by creating accountability to prioritize accessibility from the start and incorporating some gamification by showing the milestones and accessibility achievements. As we considered these three needs, visibility, education, and incentives, we decided a scorecard was the right way to drive progress. So we started to discuss an accessibility scorecard. But we didn't want to start from scratch. So what did we have available that we could use already to make these needs met? We took stock of our existing systems.
So the first thing we looked at and wanted to utilize was our service catalog. At GitHub, every line of code has an owner and is tracked through the code. The ownership mapping lives in an internal tool that we call the service catalog, and it's used to track engineering excellence. The service catalog allows us to score teams via scorecards and then measure how their service or code performs against the set of objectives or requirements. The next thing that we decided to utilize was our fundamentals program. Fundamentals is a program that promotes high priority scorecards to an enforcement tier that is reported to senior leadership. Our program outlines three pillars: availability, security, and now accessibility. And the accessibility pillar seeks to enhance GitHub's user experience by making features available to everyone, regardless of how they access information.
By tapping into the service catalog and building a scorecard tied to each service, and then having the fundamentals program enforce it for us, we would get accountability through fundamentals. Because the process of scoring is separate from the enforcement of that scoring, we needed to create clarity for fundamentals to know what to enforce. Accessibility becoming a fundamental puts it on the radars of the executive team, and product teams already know to prioritize fundamental scorecards over other scorecards. So we would get that enforcement we need. Now let's dive into what the accessibility scorecard includes in order to create this clarity that we need. The accessibility scorecard became a fundamental in fall of 2022 after a 6-month process.
And at this time, our scorecard is composed of three objectives: audit progress, static analysis, and dynamic analysis. Audit progress is analyzing the progress of a service or team using audit data. Static analysis is analyzing the progress of a service using accessibility linting violation data. And dynamic analysis is analyzing the progress of a service using accessibility end-to-end testing data. And now over the next couple slides, we're going to go deeper into each objective and share how we made them possible. So with that, let's go to our first.
The first objective we score teams on is audit progress. Accessibility compliance from a legal perspective is measured based on formal WCAG audits. So we needed to create scores to help teams take action on the results of their audits. We chose 5 requirements to measure each team's audit progress. First, an accessibility audit must be requested according to a team's maintenance SLA or service level agreement, meaning each team must adhere to a timeline for requesting audits for each feature that they own. The other 4 requirements tie timelines to each audit issue based on its severity. Severity 1 issues must be closed within 30 days, 2, 60 days, 3, 90 days, and 4, 120 days. But how do we access all this information for tracking? To begin with, we create an SLA or service level agreement with each service for their audit timeline. This allows teams or services to tap into our audit tracking system. We codify this agreement within an SLA that ties their service to an audit request deadline. SLAs show the service name, the projects they support, and the deadline for requesting an audit. On this slide, we show an example of an SLA written in JSON for the Octocat service. This service has one project, Octocat, with code living in the GitHub/Octocat repository. Their first audit request deadline has been set to May 15th, 2023, and additionally, they have not completed an audit remediation yet, but we will track that timestamp on their SLA. This is an example service SLA, but we have generalized the data. While setting up this SLA can be a manual process that takes time, it is an opportunity to educate teams on what is required of them for accessibility and how to visualize it using the scorecard. Next, let's talk about how we track each issue's timeline for resolution based on its severity.
Okay, so we're able to track this information based on how we score or store and categorize our audit issues. All of our audit issues live in one repo. It's called the Accessibility Audits repo. And we use GitHub issue labels to label each issue and categorize them. The labels for our scorecard are severity, service name, and project name. Severity indicates the impact level of the issue, severity 1 being higher than severity 2. The service name relates to the service who owns the project, and the project relates to the feature that the issue is found in. On this slide, I show an example of one of our audit issues in the label section. In particular, though we have many labels, the 3 of interest in our service, project, and severity. Service shows service : accessibility system. Project shows project : mock project. And then the severity label is severity -2. Again, we have a ton of other labels, but we use those for internal tracking and metadata that's not related specifically to the scorecard. Okay, and so now once we've categorized and organized our audit issues, we're able to use GitHub's GraphQL API to gather all the issues by our labels, again, service name, project, and severity. And in this slide, I have an example of that query. So we have a search query that goes into the accessibility audits repo and looks for labels or audit issues with label service : GitHub Octocat service. And the query will return a set of issues with their IDs and created at dates. For each issue, we determine if it has been open longer than the allotted time allocated by its severity. And we do that using the created at information. If there is an issue that has been open over the allocated time frame, we reflect that on the scorecard. So an example would be if a service has a severity 1 issue open longer than 35 days, we're going to give them 0 points for the requirement. All severity 1 issues must be closed within 30 days. And that wraps up how we're doing audit progress. So with that, we'll move to our second objective.
Introducing accessibility at the audit stage is important, but it can be very late in the product lifecycle. So we want to allow earlier detection of some accessibility issues through static analysis. Typically, we statically analyze code through linting. Linting is a process of analyzing code in the style that it is written versus how it presents itself on a living website or application. You can think of it as somewhat similar to a spell checker. Diving into how we use linting for accessibility violations. Since some accessibility violations can be found statically just by looking at the code, we use linters to catch problems like click events on static elements, ARIA attributes on disallowed elements, and link text that isn't descriptive. The image attached depicts a linting rule that has caught the use of a disallowed role attribute on the progress bar component in a JSX file. Similarly, our linters catch these types of violations throughout our code base as a developer writes their code. To measure teams' adherence to our linting standards, we picked 4 requirements. First, all repositories must be reporting their linting metrics to our observability software. Additionally, we want to ensure all teams are keeping these linting rules enabled everywhere. So we score them based on how many places they're disabling our rules. Teams get points for having no more than 20 disables, then no more than 10, and then no linting disables at all. But how are we able to track all these data points in our systems?
All right, so for this section, I want to focus on how we're tracking disables. At GitHub, many repos are written in Ruby and TypeScript, so we focused on finding linters in those languages and then asked teams to install those linters within their repositories. Linters can be disabled on a per file or per line basis, and on my slide, I have written 2 ways to disable an ESLint rule. The first reads ESLint disable next line, followed by the name of the lint rule. This allows developers to disable a single line in the file. The second reads ESLint disable, and then followed by the name of the lint rule. This allows developers to disable the entire file that the disable is written in. Because there's so many different ways that we can enable and disable lint rules, it became important to not only track if teams were installing linters, but also track if they've been disabling rules within their code. And because of that, we came up with a way to parse our files for the disabled rules and then map those rules back to our scorecard. So how are we doing this? Using GitHub's ownership mapping, the service catalog, which I had mentioned earlier, we're able to determine which teams own a file. We then use regex patterns to search for disabled accessibility linting rules within those files. And then once we've gathered a list of all the disables for a specific service, we report that to our observability software. An example of what we're reporting might be Octocat service has 6 disables of rule no non-interactive tab index. And so then we would give Octocat service 0 points for no lint disables are present since they have 6 present. All right, so now that we've talked about static analysis, we're going to move to our final objective of the scorecard.
So static analysis is very effective in catching some accessibility violations while in the process of writing code. But we know that accessibility issues, many of them only show up in the context of a live page or application. So dynamic analysis allows us to scan and write tests on a real application or page versus on the lines of code out of that context. Under dynamic analysis, we have 3 requirements. First, we want to ensure that teams are properly hooked into our system for reporting our system of analysis by reporting all of their URL patterns through our test coverage. Finally, we want to make sure their URLs pass the ACK scan. Yeah, it is that ACK scan of AXCON. And we want none of our team's code with custom accessibility tests to have skipped those custom tests. So occasionally we write something specific to one feature that says, in order for this feature to be accessible, it has to follow this specific pattern. We don't want all that work that goes into that test to be disabled. Next, Kendall will explain how we're able to map testing data to services.
All right. Okay. So for our testing, GitHub uses an internal framework called SNEC. SNEC runs playwright tests using GitHub Actions, and it also sends metrics about those tests to our observability software. SNEC ultimately allowed us to do two things. First, by running Playwright, it allowed us to tap into the Axe scanner and run Axe tests on our GitHub URLs. And then second, we were able to use the metrics tooling to log data about each test that we ran. So during each Axe test, we first run Axe, see if a test or Axe scan is passing or failing. And then we send that URL the Axe scan ran against, as well as whether or not it passed or failed, to our observability software. Because we know what services own what URLs, we're able to use these metrics that we gather to check if a service has all of their URLs tested and has no Axe scan failures. An example of this in real life, I guess. An example of this would be a service owns 6 URLs, but they only have Axe coverage in our metrics for 2 of those URLs. When we see that, we're going to give that team 0 points for all URL patterns have test coverage. And then on this slide, I have a visual of what dynamic analysis scoring might look like. I use progress bars to indicate the progress a team has made to achieve that specific dynamic analysis requirement. And this example has 33% for all URL patterns have test coverage, 50% for 0 Axe scanner violations are found, and then 100%, meaning that they have this completely fulfilled and passing for no tests are skipped.
So now that we've gone over the 3 objectives, what kind of behaviors have these objectives started to change? While the scorecard has only been a part of fundamentals less than 6 months, we do have some good early results to share. Since launching the scorecard within fundamentals, accessibility mentions in Slack have increased 30,000, a 4.5% increase. This shows an increased visibility of accessibility work at GitHub. Additionally, mentions of the Axe tool have increased 11 times, indicating that teams are more educated about the tools available to them, and they have questions about responding to their results. Also, engagement on audit issues, as tracked by issue comments, has increased 23%, and the average number of issues closed each month has increased about 14%, with that percentage continuing to increase each month. This is showing that teams are incentivized to follow through on their accessibility problems through all the way to completion. And this is at a higher rate than it was before. These numbers have been calculated comparing the previous 5 months with the 5 months since joining fundamentals. In looking to the future, some data points are still too early to see measurable trends, and we will continue to collect metrics as the program evolves. We will be hoping to see a decrease in the total number of issues per audit because they've been caught earlier in the product lifecycle, but we'll have to have more teams receive their second audit in order to measure this reliably. We will also want to see 0 Axe violations when a team requests an audit, indicating that they're using our available tools before asking for validation of their work. Additionally, we want to see increased discovery of keyboard navigation problems earlier in the product lifecycle. This would indicate that teams are learning from doing accessibility work and incorporating those learnings into their everyday development work.
All right, thank you so much for coming to our talk. We have been really excited about this scorecard and are excited to see where it takes us. If you want to reach us after the presentation, we're both available on Twitter and LinkedIn, and we're happy to answer any questions. And with that,
right.
we'll
Yeah, thank you both so much. Really great information. There's lots of questions, so we'll jump right in. at the beginning of the talk, you talked about your fundamentals, and there was a question about what did it take to get accessibility added to that list of fundamentals?
So the fundamentals program is already an existing program that was very security heavy, as understandable by being a software company. And so when we started to approach them saying, we think fundamentals might be a good fit for us, but some of these requirements that we see may not fit our needs, it was a negotiation with the delegates from fundamentals and the people that run that program to see if we can adjust the requirements or if it wasn't a good fit. And it turned out we were able to adjust some of the requirements. That's why it took 6 months. We had to stand up a staging scorecard in order for them to see what the data might look like. We had to make sure that all of the data was aggregated automatically instead of counted manually, and a few other steps like that. But basically, we worked with the people that were already doing the work.
Very good. How did you define severity due to contextual differences, and how could that change based on different disabilities?
That is a good question. We do incorporate some previous measurements of severity to kind of generalize. If something is a severity 1, it means that someone with a disability has no alternative means of performing that action, and so it must be resolved in some way. A severity 2 would be it's very inconvenient to do an alternative action, and maybe difficult to discover, and so it should be solved. Severity 3 would be it's more of a usability problem, it should be solved. Severity 4 is like doing this would just create a better experience in general, but no major barrier is found. So I'm generalizing here, but I hope that answers the question.
I think so. And I think that maybe just an add-on might be about how does that change based on different disabilities? And I think the answer to that is it doesn't, right?
Yeah, it doesn't in general. Ideally, we're considering all disabilities and experiences that we should be in that severity rating.
Great. How did you automatically identify nondescriptive link text? Is that targeting the usual suspects like click here more or doing some sort of natural language processing?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of that question?
Yeah. So did you have a way to automatically identify nondescriptive link text, or were you just following like the standards like the click here and more and things like that?
Yeah, so we actually use that's one of our lint rules we use. And I believe it's defined in the I'm not positive on this, but I think it's the GitHub ERB lint rules is where that rule is defined. It's one of the 3 that were in the slide. So it was either ESLint, JSX, A11Y, ERB lint, or Rubocop. Oh, I don't remember the name of the other. Let me just go back to the slide so I can actually get the names right. Okay. Robocop Rails accessibility, ERV lint GitHub, or ESLint plugin JSX A11Y.
Okay. And
just to note, this is this is static analysis, and so we do have other tools that do more dynamic analysis, but for the sake of scoring, we just use the predefined common hitters that we know are always going to be problematic in some way.
Excellent. And for anyone that didn't catch all those that Kendall mentioned, the slides are on the AxCon site, so they're there if you needed to grab them. This one, I think you kind of covered this, but I just want to bring it up again and revisit it. So when you're checking for disabled linter rules, did you find teams working around that? So you talked about that a little bit. This question came up afterwards though. And then were teams pushing back on those rules that cause false positives, and how did you handle that?
So the first part of that question was just just to clarify, were teams pushing back on the fact that we were tracking the disables?
Yeah, if they were finding ways to work around disabling the linter rules.
Okay, no. So the really nice thing is no one has bad intention, or what we have found that is a lot of the times the rules aren't getting disabled because of bad intention. things need to get merged quickly and they had intent to remove it and just then forgot about the rule. So we've noticed that as we're tracking the disables and that we're scoring teams, it's actually making a lot of teams go back and remove those disables and fix the violations.
Great.
We'll also add that occasionally we do have someone come to us and say, okay, I tried to get around the rule this way, and we realize they're going through so many gymnastics to try to get around the disabled rule. And so we should create better documentation or consider an alternative rule. And so obviously we're young-ish in this scorecard process, and so we are learning when we do see those happen, but they're edge cases for the most part.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here about recommendations for an HTML linter. You talked about Axe in yours. Anything else that you've come across or anything about Axe that really stands out?
Okay, sorry. So the first part of that was about an HTML linter. So I'll just tackle that first. We actually noticed that that was a gap that we needed recently. For now, I haven't done the research on which HTML linter is best or what's available, but it's something that we've realized that we need and we are working to add those. So the beauty of this is it's never the way that we've structured things is we can add linters as we go, and we're tracking the specific disables, the lines that disable. So adding more rules doesn't change what we're doing on the scorecard. It just adds to it. The next question was about, what was the second part of that again?
Do you want me to take the second part, Kendall?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So this is a good point that the Axe scan is a little bit duplicative of some HTML validation for accessibility, but we consider that dynamic analysis because usually we like to run the Axe scan on a full page. And so we are considering whether we continue to invest in HTML standard linting or if we continue to expand our Axe support on dynamic analysis.
Right. And then this one is a really good question. So your severity setting, is that taking into account the location of the issue? Meaning, what if it's in a non-critical journey and things like that? The workflow isn't critical. How are you accounting for that, if at all?
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah. Right now, it's a bit of a primitive, like, okay, if somebody can't do something they want to do, then it's a severity 1, that sort of thing. We are working on an exceptions process where something like this is a non-critical area would be make something a candidacy for the timeline extension on a severity 1. I would guess that we would not recategorize it, but just it qualifies for an exception or an extension instead. But that's something we're working through process. We've got a framework in place. We're building out the edge cases.
Great. I think that is all of the questions that we have in the Q&A right now. If anyone wants to throw any other questions in, go ahead and do that. I'm just running through our chat here. I don't think there's any other questions here either. Any words of advice or anything, Kendall or Katie, before we wrap up for today?
I think if there are ways that you can make it easier for people to conceptualize your accessibility work and take action for themselves, you're going to see some cool results. It's a huge challenge. So good luck. Reach out to us and let us know how your journey goes. We'd love to hear.
All right, and we did get some more questions in. So,
okay.
Does GitHub have native mobile apps? And if so, does the scorecard apply to those code bases as well?
So GitHub does have native apps. Right now, I don't think we have those apps on the scorecard. We're onboarding teams slowly because it is a bit of a process to make SLAs. But yeah, we're planning on doing that as well as well, maybe not specifically for linters. We'd have to add some exceptions where maybe we score mobile for audit, but we exempt them from linting because it wouldn't make sense. At this time, we've been focusing though on the website itself.
We do have the desktop app, if any of you use GitHub desktop. And they do have linting rules applied that we're able to score in the way that they run their systems. And so their first party integration with our scorecard. Special cases for native apps like mobile, where it take a little more time to roll out. So we are working on that. And then we are also working with the CLI team. So anything with an interface will end up on the scorecard. And as Kendall alluded to, if it doesn't make sense for linting to run, we will disable the linting requirement and give them full points.
All right. How are you testing SPA or visibility toggling features? And if you and how do you rerun acts on a page interaction and end-to-end tests? How's that all working?
Yeah, so that's something we've been talking about as a team because we realized that if you run acts on like on a page, you might not have the dialogues open, you might not see or have all the expandable sections available and being checked through that act scan. That's something we're talking about. For us, as far as scorecard and scoring, it's a little bit harder to track what like if teams are able to open every section and run acts on every section. Right now, what we have available is utilizing the URLs and knowing that what teams own which URLs. We just don't know what teams specifically own an expand or collapse section. What's nice though is we run acts on Primer, which is our our design system. It's open source. And so what we're doing is we're hoping we're catching a lot of those bugs earlier. And, you know, if there's issues with expandable collapse sections, we're tackling that at the design system level before it gets into our code base.
We may add further states to our act scan if we're finding that they're really, really dynamic interaction patterns that we need to scan separately. And we're working on that. The dynamic section was added after the static and audit progress sections. And so it's still it's a baby. We're helping it grow.
And then this question is about audits being completed. How are you doing that at scale? And how are those issues flowing back into your accessibility repository?
Do you mean how is the audit being conducted, or how is are the audit issues being completed? I'm not sure, remediated.
I think the question is more about how you are doing this at scale, making sure you're reaching all corners of the product.
We do utilize vendors to help us perform audits, and we do break up pieces of the product into sections in order to partner with those teams. So we say an audit is undergoing right now. Please be prepared to do remediation, and then we do a handoff process. And then all that information is available to them on the scorecard to help them track their own progress. And then, of course, if they're not making progress, fundamentals helps us out. So we scale by utilizing vendors for some of it. We scale by utilizing the feature teams who own that feature to take action. And we support with tooling and processes and the scorecard and all the other things that the central accessibility team maintains. And then we lean on fundamentals if that's not enough.
Great. A question about severity again. You have severity 0 issues in GitHub. Does accessibility ever qualify for a generic Sev 1, 0 or Sev 1 relative to other bugs?
So our actual bug severities, like tickets that come in are given a severity, that severity is different from our accessibility audit issue severity. So for us, we just have the 1 through 4 defined.
All right. Has GitHub required WCAG training and or credentials in writing accessible code for teams?
GitHub has not required WCAG training in an organizational sense. In order to be able to finish issues, we require it to perform the tasks of your job. That's a broader education question, right? That we're rolling out. We're piloting some new things for. So
Great. Yeah, just about how to support teams in the learning process. Yep.
Yeah, as mentioned, we're rolling out some new things on how we can educate hubbers on accessibility and give them more training. But another thing that we do is office hours. So as teams are remediating audit issues, they can come to our office hours and ask us questions. And it's been very helpful. And we record those and share them out to people who couldn't make the office hours, but might still want the knowledge.
And this next question, are audits and subsequent remediation fixes flowing through in your customer communications, or how are you handling that like at a project level?
Customer feedback cycles are being worked on. There are certain customers that get immediate priority. So we do treat customer reported issues as a different internal tier. But we are working on our system for customer feedback loops.
Great. Do you track accessibility issues that can't be found using automated tools? How does that factor into your process?
So that's our audit issues. So that first objective audit analysis, that is coming from real testers looking at our specific features and writing down audit or issues that they find. And that's why it's important that we have a separate repo for that and label things properly so we can make sure that we include that actual audit on a score and make sure that we're not just using automation and tooling.
Additionally, we do have members of the centralized accessibility team who are subject matter experts that have credentials and training to do audits, and we're allowed to file issues as well within the repo as a part of our work. And we do take internal feedback as well into account and file those issues on behalf of people with disabilities within GitHub. If there's not a customer reported issue already, we do the same. So the same system for audits can be used for internal reporting. Sorry,
okay.
Go ahead, Heidi.
No, that's great. I have a question. Are you are you incorporating feedback from users with disabilities as you're doing your testing and looping that into? Do you have them as part of user groups?
We do. We have members of our team with disabilities as well. And,
amazing.
We would like a more robust system for incorporating perspectives of people with disabilities outside the central team and outside of our auditors. But where we're at, we'll get there.
Yeah. Yes. Kind of a more personal question, not about accessibility necessarily, but were you both working in accessibility prior to your roles at GitHub? And if so, how did you work and make that pivot?
For me, I could start. I started my career at Workday, and one of the first tasks I was asked to do was make a drag and drop feature. And Workday is really cool. They ask that anything that goes through the pipeline only is merged if it's accessible. And so I think with that being such a big task, I actually really fell in love with accessibility, and I thought it was so cool. And like, you get to help so many people, but you also get to solve cool problems and think of things in different ways. So then when I switched companies and just moved on in my career, I tried to make sure that I incorporated accessibility in whatever job that I was taking on. And then I just got to a point where I was like, I want to do this full time. And so that's when I joined GitHub.
Similarly, one of my first engineering roles was for a government contracting company here in the US, and all government products must adhere to WCAG 2.0 at the time. And I think it was AAA. And so I learned a lot about accessibility from that role and continued it through many roles since. And my previous role, my team was sort of taking the charge with building a more accessible white label that multiple brands injected into. And I knew as a part of that that I wasn't satisfied just caring about accessibility. I wanted to come make it a full-time role, and I saw that GitHub was hiring and decided it's time to make a jump. And I guess GitHub agreed.
We're so glad that you did. This one, you may have visited it, but they would like you to let them know about the frequency of those audits that you're running. And is it different for each team, or how are you handling the frequency of the audits happening?
It is a minimum of once a year, and we will promote specific teams or services to more frequent as necessary. But because we're still early in our process, everybody is minimum of once a year.
That's our questions.
Thank you.
Lots of questions. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, really great ones. Thanks, everybody, for sending those through.
Who was helping us. And thanks, Kendall.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. Thanks, everybody. Take care.